Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Here we have a hand that I did not play, but someone apparently named Chad played it, and I decided to review this hand because I think it is pretty educational. So here, Chad only has a 23 big blind stack and makes it 3 big blinds from early position. I would definitely suggest that he makes it smaller with his whole range, probably a min raise, maybe 2.3 big blinds or 2.5 big blinds. And now, the cutoff and the button both call. We don't know what Chad has, and that's okay. I actually do know what Chad has, and I'll tell you in just a minute. Flop comes ace, 3, 3. And now Chad bets 200. So if you're going to bet in this scenario with your whole range, I definitely think you want to bet on the small side, because notice an ace is never folding to any bet size. And if your opponent has an ace and you have a better ace, well, that's just great, because you can bet the flop small, bet the turn small, and then shove the river. And those hands are very rarely going to fold. If someone has a 3, of course, they're also never going to fold. But if they have worse than those hands, like king high, they probably are going to fold to any bet. Or if they have even an underpair, they're going to be very cautious versus any bet. So this is a spot where I think you want to bet small with your strong hands and your bluffs. I don't necessarily think you want to be doing too much bluffing into 2 players, because someone is going to have an ace a decent amount of the time. So it's an interesting spot. I guess I'll go ahead and tell you what Chad has here. He has ace queen. And I like this bet. This is a spot where you can very easily bet for value. With hands like ace queen, you can get called by worse aces, you can get called by flush draws, and when you bet this small, you're going to get called by small pairs sometimes, and that's also fantastic. So he does bet 200 with ace queen, and now he gets raised to 600. I'm not going to say this is like the easiest spot in the world. I don't think Chad could possibly fold. This is a very clear spot where he cannot fold. The question now becomes, do you want to call or do you want to go all in? And I would say here, pretty much regardless of Chad's stack, as long as he has about 2,000 chips or less at this point, I would be going all in. And normally, if you've been watching a lot of these videos here on Poker News, you'll know that I'm not a big fan of re-raising on the flop with top pair, because usually when you get called, you're not going to be too happy. This is a unique scenario though, because now, if our opponent has an ace, he's never going to fold. And notice that all of the button's aces should be worse than our ace besides ace 3, because you would think you would 3-bet ace king before the flop. So we're just going to get it in good versus top pairs, which is great. And if he has a flush draw, if he calls it off, he's getting it in slightly bad. And if he folds, that's also great, because those hands all have 35% equity, or maybe even a little bit more, depending on what he has. So the only time this is really bad for us with our ace queens when our opponent has a 3. But remember, we're not folding when he has a 3 anyway. Because like I said, with ace queen, we just cannot fold this hand. So how weak of a hand should Chad be willing to get it all in here for his 800 total chips when he bets 200 and then gets raised? Actually, he had 1,000 to start, so he bet 200, he has 800 left. I think you should be willing to get it all in here with probably ace 9 or better. With ace 8 or worse, it's a pretty tough spot at that point. I mean, really, Chad should not be opening ace 8 from early position off a 23 big blind stack, so fortunately, we never even have to think about that scenario because it never comes up. But with all of the aces, I just think you cannot fold. If Chad had pocket kings on this flop, I don't think he needs to bet. I would just check and see what develops. If you check, I'd probably check call one time and then check fold on the turn. Alternatively, you could also just check call with hands like ace queen on the flop. I think that's also fine, especially if you think your opponents are particularly weak. But in this scenario, I think you just want to go ahead and bet to get it all in for maybe 2,000 or less. And if you have more than 2,000, now you're going to want to start calling when you bet and get raised. Because if you're against an ace may now fold if you shove, which would be a disaster, right? Because all the aces are drawing relatively thin. And if you are against a flush draw, I mean, you don't care if those hands fold, so I guess you would like to shove against those, but you don't know you're against a flush draw. And also, really, your opponent should not raise here with a flush draw very often at all. I guess we should discuss that. Like, if you're sitting here with a flush draw, and your opponent bets 200, you should virtually never raise. Because if your opponent has an ace, clearly they're never folding, and you're getting it all in bad. And if your opponent doesn't have an ace, they're often just going to check fold on the turn. They'll check the turn, you can then bet 300, and now they're going to fold whatever they have. And if you get the flush, obviously you win those times too. So by shoving or raising with a club in seat 9 spot here, you basically just get it in bad every time you're beat by an ace or better. And the times that your opponent was drawing thin, you were probably going to win those, or by the times your opponent has worse than an ace, you probably were going to win those pots anyway. So this would be a particularly bad raise with a flush draw. So given that, I think we should be against a lot of threes and aces here, and obviously there should be very few threes in the range. And if you have a hand like ace jack or better, ace 10 or better, you can very easily get it all in against the marginal aces, especially given maybe even ace queen 3-bets you pre-flop, and then maybe you're against ace jack and worse. So very easy spot to get it all in with ace queen, I think. It's a lot of work to get it all in with just ace queen on a pretty obvious spot, but you definitely want to think about these scenarios away from the table so that you can have a very clear idea of what to do in these scenarios before you run into them. So the opponent did have a flush draw, king jack of clubs, and I think this was a particularly awful raise, especially with the king high, because king high can win at the showdown even. I mean, I don't think you need to even turn this hand into a bluff, because if you're against something like jack 10 that decided to bet the flop, well, you crush that. And by raising, you let that hand that you are just completely crushing fold. So even though it may seem kind of obvious to raise with your draws, and I think a lot of amateur players think they should just raise with all their flush draws, especially their good ones, that's actually not the case. I would much prefer to see a raise. Like if you told me you had to raise with a flush draw, I would want to be raising with hands like 5-4 of clubs and 7-6 of clubs, because those hands cannot win at showdown. And if I bet the flop and then I jam the turn with a random bluff like jack 10, and then 7-6 of clubs will have to fold, that would be pretty bad. So if you want to bluff in this spot with some flush draws, you want to do it with your worst flush draws, not your king high ones, especially because that could conceivably even win at showdown unimproved. So pretty poorly played by the opponent. He ends up not winning the pot. It's always good whenever your opponents play poorly and they don't win. But interesting hand. I think this is a pretty obvious spot with ace queen, but maybe not so obvious if you have the weaker hands. And maybe we would have ended up getting bluffed out of this pot if we had a hand like pocket kings. If we check call the flop and then check folded the turn, would have been pretty tough. But notice that if our opponent just plays it aggressively in that spot by betting when check to, he's going to be doing pretty well. So that's going to be it for this hand for PokerNews.com. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this type of content, definitely check out PokerCoaching.com. There I have a lot of educational hand quizzes, kind of similar to these hands, except for instead of me telling you what I would do, I make you tell me what you would do. And then I go through and analyze your decisions and let you know what I think about your play. So you can get a free 7-day trial to that over at PokerCoaching.com. Thank you very much for watching, and be sure to check back next week for another educational poker hand.